In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this walnut and steel end table in under 7 years. First, have the idea to build the end table. Then shut down your longboard factory that's acting as your workshop and move all your tools into storage while living in a townhouse. Next, get a new job. Move to a new house that has a garage. Then have a kid. When the kid's about a year old and sleep trained, then you design and build the end table. Let's jump in there. I started out in a sketchbook to iterate on a few ideas before going into 3D. I modeled the room to provide some context while designing. Then I made a handful of 3D models, building off the ideas in the sketches. Initially I chose this design, and I went all out designing a mechanism so that the top could swing out over the couch. Before going too far into the build, I wanted to make sure the overall size and proportions were right. So I used tack welding to make a quick mock-up so I can set it in place and see how it looked in the room. And it was good that I tested things out because everything ended up being a little bit too big in pretty much every dimension. So I had to go back to the CAD and scale everything down to make it a size that's going to fit in that space a little bit better. At this point, I also decided to switch to a different design. I preferred the one with the top and the bottom shelf and a little bit of an angle to give us some interesting lines. So at this point, I took apart the frame and cleaned up what was left of the tack welds. Next, I need to cut the pieces to length based on the plans. So I'm going to start off with the straight cuts since they're a bit easier. For the parts that are the same length, I clamp them together to make the cuts in one pass. For these cuts, I'm using my custom metal bandsaw setup. It's built around a cheap Harbor Freight portable bandsaw and has a table on top for free-handed cuts in a vertical orientation and a channel and a hinge down bottom so I can clamp in longer stock and get clean square cuts. For most of these cuts, the accuracy isn't super important because as long as the vertical pieces are the same length and the horizontal pieces are the same length, then our frame's going to be square. When we get to the wood portion, we're going to cut that to size based on how the frame turns out. So it doesn't matter if things are off a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch here and there. But keeping things square will make the assembly much easier. For the angle cuts, I used a speed square to mark the angles and then made the cut freehand on the bandsaw. Then I set the belt sander to the same angle so I could grind them flat. With all the pieces cut, I could start laying them out and clamping them down. Now that everything is clamped in place, I'm going to tack weld all the joints. Now it's time to weld everything solid. With the first half welded up, I'm going to grind the welds flat and move on to the next step. I used an angle grinder with a flap disc since it removes material quickly and leaves a polished surface. Now the first side of the frame is done, I need to weld up the other half. It's pretty much going to be the same process, except now I can use the completed half as a template while I'm clamping it together. And since we already saw the welding process, we can jump to the two completed halves. Before welding the cross pieces, I'm going to drill some through holes. Those holes will be used to mount the top when the piece is finished. Next, I'm going to clamp in and weld the cross pieces to finish up the frame. I cut some wooden spacer blocks to keep the whole frame square while we're welding these up. So I'm just about done with the frame. The last thing is to add 2 extra mounting points for the top surface. For the bottom shelf, we already have 4 mounting holes that we drilled in the cross pieces. For the top, we have 2 back here, but nothing up front. So we'll make 2 brackets to solve this problem. I found some scrap metal and marked out a shape for the brackets. The overall size and shape isn't particularly important. It just needs a corner cut out for the square tubing and a hole for the screw to go through. Attaching these brackets and all the metal joints in this piece really highlights some of the differences between woodworking and metalworking. In woodworking, you have to think a lot about the joinery and how you're going to attach pieces together to make a strong joint. In metalworking, often you just need to butt 2 pieces up together, and once they're in the position you want, you can weld them in place. With the frame done, it's time to start working on the wood parts. So this is the walnut plywood I'm going to be using for the top surface and for the shelf. So as I'm marking these cuts, the one thing I'm thinking about is how the grain is going to line up. You can see on these panels there's a pattern where the veneer is book matched. So I want to make sure that I'm marking along the center line so that once the final piece is cut, everything will be symmetrical with these grain patterns. So I stuck up on the cuts little by little until they matched the length of the frame. For the bottom shelf, I need to make a 35-degree cut referencing this top surface. Since the table saw blade starts off vertical, it would actually need to tilt to 55 degrees to make that cut. So what I need to do is make that cut in a vertical orientation with the blade at 35 degrees. In order to do that, I made this jig that will run along the fence so I can clamp the workpiece to it and keep everything secure while making that cut in the vertical orientation. For my table saw, the blade tilts towards the fence, which isn't ideal because we're going to end up with a triangular offcut that can get trapped between the blade and the fence. That little piece can kick back, but with everything clamped secure, we can stand out of the way and it should be safe. After checking the length of the panels, I ripped them to their final width. With the parts cut down to size, now it was time to apply the edge banding to cover up the layers of the plywood. Most of this was pretty straightforward, except for the angled section, which was too wide for one piece, so I had to use 2. When I lined them up initially, there were some gaps from uneven edges. So I used a hand plane to quickly joint the edges. That way they'd be perfectly straight and create a seamless joint. To trim the ends of the edge banding, I used wire cutters and a razor to cut them flush. For the long edges, there's a tool specifically designed to do this. I don't have one, so I used a small block plane to trim it down flush. It helps if you shine a hard light on the edge. That gives you a really distinct shadow anywhere where the edge banding is still high. So you keep planing those areas, and once the shadow's gone, you know you have a flush surface. The last step before finishing is to sand the surface even. I started off with a detail sander and 180 grit, but it was leaving some subtle swirl marks in the wood. So I switched to hand sanding using a block of wood and a foam pad. I'm going to start with 180 grit, go up to 240, and probably call it there. With the sanding done, it's time to move on to the finish. So I made some samples with a combination of these finishes. The armor seal was used as the top coat for all of the finishes for durability. The shellac and boiled linseed oil were used to bring out the tones in the wood. I picked the sample that was the combination of all 3 finishes because I really liked the rich dark tone. First I applied 2 coats of the boiled linseed oil. Then I applied 3 coats of amber de-waxed shellac, waiting 10 to 15 minutes between each coat for it to dry to the touch. And last up were 3 coats of semi-gloss armor seal, lightly sanding with 400 grit between each coat. I tend to prefer wipe-on finishes over brush-on because it's easy to get streak-free results and pretty hard to mess up. So with the wood finished, it's time to finish up the frame. I started off by cleaning it with some degreaser, and then spray painted it matte black. After letting everything cure, it was time for assembly. I marked the center of the mounting holes, using the frame as a reference. Then I pre-drilled the holes to avoid splitting. Then I assembled the base to the top with screws, making sure they were short enough that they wouldn't poke through the top. I did this by hand to make sure I wouldn't strip out the holes. The process for mounting the lower shelf was the same, with the addition of some clamps to hold it in place. Before putting the end tables in place, I designed some feet out of some soft plastic called TPU. I printed them in 2 sizes. In case the table wobbles after it's installed, I can easily swap them out to fix it. And with that done, the end tables were complete. Overall, I'm really happy with how these came out. I put a lot of work into the design up front, because I'm planning on building more furniture for this room. I wanted to choose materials and design elements that would work on other pieces, like a media console. But for now, I'm just happy to have a place to put my mug. And for anyone who followed all the steps of this build, make sure to share your project so we can check it out in 2028 and congratulate you on your new kit.